In the soft, gray light before the first sunrise, the world that would become Kanto was nothing more than a silent expanse of stone and mist. The land breathed in a slow, rhythmic pulse, shaped by forces far older than memory or record. Great tectonic plates shifted beneath the surface like slumbering giants, carving out the deep basins and jagged peaks that define the horizon. It was a time of stillness, where the only sound was the crashing of waves against the primordial shore and the whistling of wind through the hollows of the earth. There was no color yet, only the shifting shades of a world waiting to be born, a vast canvas of raw elemental power. This was the era of the great shaping, when the foundations of the earth were laid down with a patient, deliberate hand. The mountains rose toward the heavens, their summits cloaked in eternal snow, while the valleys dipped low, ready to receive the first rains that would eventually turn them into lush, green cradles of life. Into this empty world came the first flickers of spirit. They did not arrive as the creatures we know today, but as whispers of energy, ancient and formless. They moved through the rock and the water, giving weight to the stones and depth to the seas. The land began to respond to their presence. In the deepest caverns, where the heat of the Earth's core lingered, the first tremors of heat began to manifest in physical form. In the highest reaches of the atmosphere, the friction of the winds gave birth to the first sparks of electricity. The world was no longer just a physical space. It was becoming a living vessel, a container for the extraordinary. This was the dawn of the Pokémon world, a period of transition where the line between the physical and the metaphysical was thin, and the potential for life was woven into every grain of sand and every drop of ocean spray. As the eons passed, the mists began to clear, revealing a landscape of breathtaking variety. To the north, the mountains of Indigo stood as silent sentinels, their heights unreachable and their secrets guarded by the thin, cold air. To the south, the vast ocean stretched toward an infinite horizon, its surface calm but its depths teeming with a quiet, burgeoning power. The island that would one day be known as Cinnabar sat as a dark jewel in the blue expanse, its volcanic heart beating with a steady, subterranean fire. The land was settling, finding its permanent shape, and with this stability came the first true stirrings of biological existence. It was a slow awakening, a process that took countless centuries to unfold. The first plants began to cling to the rocks, thin mosses and hardy ferns that turned the gray world into a tapestry of emerald and gold. Deep within the damp earth and beneath the heavy pressure of the tides, the first Pokémon began to emerge. These were the ancients, the ancestors of all that would follow. They were beings of heavy armor and sharp instinct, built to survive a world that was still finding its balance. Some moved with slow, rhythmic grace through the sunless depths of the sea, their bodies adapted to the crushing weight of the water. Others crawled onto the muddy banks of the first rivers, their shells hardening in the warmth of the sun. These prehistoric dwellers were the first keepers of the region's lore, their lives governed by the cycles of the moon and the changing of the seasons. They did not speak, but their presence filled the land with a sense of purpose. They were the architects of the ecosystem, their movements carving paths through the forests and their migrations shaping the very flow of the rivers. Among these ancient beings, there was one whose presence was felt rather than seen, a spark of pure, unadulterated potential, drifting through the high canopies of the emerging jungles. This was the entity of myth, the one who held the blueprint for all living things within its very essence. It was a creature of shimmering light, appearing and disappearing like a dream. It did not belong to the land or the sea, but to the air and the spirit. It watched as the world grew, its eyes reflecting the birth of stars and the cooling of the earth. It was the silent witness to the first flights of the winged ones and the first hunts of the predators. This being was the bridge between the old world and the new, a reminder that all life, no matter how diverse, shared a single luminous origin. The region began to diversify, its climate stabilizing into the distinct zones that would later define its geography. The central plains became a vast sea of grass, swaying in the breeze like a green ocean. The forests grew thick and deep, their canopies so dense that the forest floor lived in a perpetual twilight. The air became filled with the scents of blooming flora and the ozone of passing storms. Life was no longer a struggle for mere existence. It was becoming a celebration of variety. The ancient Pokémon began to evolve, their forms changing to better suit the niches they occupied. Some grew wings to claim the sky, their shadows dancing over the hills below. Others developed the ability to blend into the shadows, becoming the ghosts of the woods and the caves. The world was finding its voice, a chorus of cries and rustles that echoed through the canyons. Humans, when they finally arrived, were humble and few. They did not come as conquerors, but as wanderers, drawn to the abundance of the land and the mystery of its inhabitants. They settled in small clusters, building shelters of wood and stone that mirrored the natural formations around them. They watched the Pokémon with awe and reverence, recognizing in them a power that was far greater than their own. The early relationship between humans and Pokémon was one of quiet observation and mutual respect. The humans learned to read the signs of the earth by watching the movements of the herds. They knew a storm was coming when the winged ones flew low, and they knew the rivers were safe when the water dwellers were calm. There was a profound harmony in those early days, a shared existence that required no words. The first settlements were established in places where the veil between the human world and the natural world was thinnest. Pallet, a small collection of huts near the southern coast, was a place of eternal spring, where the air was always sweet and the grass always soft. It was a place of beginnings, a quiet harbor where the journey of understanding first started. To the north, Pewter was built among the gray stones and ancient fossils, its people developing a deep connection to the history of the earth. They were the keepers of the mountains, their lives intertwined with the resilience of the rock. These early humans did not seek to change the world. They sought to understand their place within it. They told stories of the great beings that lived in the clouds and the depths, weaving a mythology that would endure for thousands of years. As the first settlements grew roots into the soil of Kanto, the bond between the people and the land deepened through discovery and necessity. Early wanderers ventured into the wilds, mapping the contours of the territory and naming landmarks that would become legendary. They discovered hidden groves where light seemed to dance with a life of its own, and dark caves where the air hummed with a low, vibrating energy. They found places of power where elemental forces were most concentrated. These locations were treated with a solemnity that bordered on the sacred. No structures were built there. Instead, they were left as monuments to the raw beauty of the region. Humans understood they were guests in this land, and that the true masters were the ancient Pokémon who had shaped the earth since the beginning. In the shadows of the great peaks and the depths of the oldest woods, the legendary guardians watched the newcomers. They were the embodiments of the cold, the storm, and the flame, beings of such immense power that their presence altered the weather and the terrain. They did not interfere with the small lives of humans, but their influence was felt in every frost-covered leaf and every bolt of lightning. They were the pillars of regional stability, ensuring no one element became too dominant. The balance was a finely tuned instrument played by the hands of nature. The early history of the region is a story of this balance, a narrative of how the land, the Pokémon, and the humans found a way to exist in a world that was as dangerous as it was beautiful. The passage of time in this era was not marked by days, but by the slow turning of the world itself. Forests grew older and deeper, rivers carved paths firmly into the stone, and the bond between all living things strengthened. Stories told around evening fires became the foundation of cultural identity, a memory of a time when the world was young and great beings walked among the trees. It was a time of peace, but beneath the surface, seeds of change were being sown. The harmony of the early days would eventually be tested as human ambition grew and the mysteries of the Pokémon were unraveled by the persistent light of inquiry. For a long age, the region was at rest, wrapped in the quiet embrace of its own creation. As civilizations flourished, the landscape showed signs of long-term habitation. Small clusters of dwellings evolved into the first true villages, each developing a culture based on natural resources. In the north, the village of Pewter became a center of stonework and ancient history. Inhabitants learned to listen to the whispers of the mountains, discovering that the rocks held the preserved remains of the world that came before. They found spiral shells and jagged teeth frozen in stone for millions of years. These fossils were treated as sacred relics, bridges to a prehistoric past that felt both alien and familiar. The people developed a temperament much like the stone they worked with, steady, enduring, and deeply connected to the foundations of the earth. To the east, where mountains sloped into misty caves, early settlers discovered the profound depths of the subterranean world. This was a place of darkness and echoes, where the sun never reached and the air was heavy with the scent of minerals. In these lightless halls, a different kind of life flourished. Humans who ventured into the depths found colonies of creatures that lived in perfect harmony with the shadows, their movements guided by sound and intuition rather than sight. The caves were seen as the womb of the region, a place of secrets and introspection. It was here that the first philosophies of the inner self began to emerge, as people realized there was as much to explore within the darkness of the mind as there was in the brightness of day. Along the azure shores of the eastern sea, a village rose where rivers met the ocean. This place, known later as Cerulean, was defined by the purity of its water. People here were keepers of the currents, their lives governed by tides and migrations. They built homes near waterfalls and clear pools, believing that the movement of water represented the flow of time and the inevitability of change. The water was a mirror, reflecting the sky and the trees, and the people of the coast learned to see the world as a series of interconnected ripples. They developed a grace and fluidity in their movements, a reflection of the element they revered. The sea was their provider and protector, a vast and mysterious expanse holding the promise of the unknown. In the very heart of the region, a great forest began to grow, its trees reaching heights that seemed to support the sky. This was the emerald lung of the land, a place of vibrant life and perpetual green. The air beneath the canopy was cool and still, filtered through a million leaves and smelling of moss and decaying wood. This forest was a sanctuary for smaller, more delicate beings, a place where the cycle of life and death was visible in every rotting log and sprouting seed. Humans who lived on the fringes were observers of small miracles, the emergence of a winged insect from its cocoon or the quiet growth of a mushroom in the dark. They learned that the greatest power often resided in the smallest things, and that the health of the forest was the health of the entire land. Settlements established a network of paths and trails that connected different regions. These were not just routes for travel, but threads that wove diverse cultures into a single, cohesive tapestry. A traveler could start in the pastoral fields of the south, move through the dense forests of the center, and reach the cold passes of the north, experiencing the full spectrum of the land's elemental character. Along these paths, small shrines were built to honor the guardians, places where a wanderer could stop and reflect. These shrines were simple structures, often nothing more than a ring of stones, but they served as anchors for the spirit, reminders of the ancient bonds that tied all living things together. The relationship between humans and Pokémon reached a point of profound synergy. They were no longer just observers. They were companions in the long journey of existence. Pokémon helped humans till the soil, clear the paths, and protect villages from the occasional surges of raw energy. In return, humans provided care and a shared purpose, creating a partnership based on mutual necessity and deep-seated affection. This was the golden age of cooperation, a time before the rise of industry and the complications of modern society. The world felt whole and integrated, a place where the physical and the spiritual were in constant, harmonious dialogue. Yet, even in this era of peace, humans began to look toward the horizon with a new kind of longing. They started to wonder about the limits of their knowledge and the true extent of the powers that govern their world. They began to ask questions that had no easy answers, probing the mysteries of the stars and the secrets of the deep. Curiosity was now driving them to master the land. They began to build larger structures, to create more complex tools, and to seek ways to harness the energy of the world for their own ends. The seeds of the future were being planted in the fertile soil of the present, and the story was preparing to turn a more complicated page. The stillness of the dawn was fading, and the bright light of a new day was beginning to take hold across the horizon. As the civilizations of the region flourished, the first great cities began to rise from the foundations of the early villages, marking a transition from humble settlement to a period of organized expansion. This was an era defined by the architecture of harmony, where human ingenuity sought to mirror the elegance of the natural world. The landscape was no longer just a backdrop for survival. It became a partner in progress. In the west, the sturdiness of the mountains inspired the people of Pewter to refine their mastery of stone, while in the east, the rhythmic flow of the rivers shaped the philosophy of those living in Cerulean. These urban centers were not mere clusters of stone and wood, but living organisms that breathed in synchronization with the cycles of the earth. The roads connecting them grew wider and more resilient, forming a network of commerce and cultural exchange that wove the disparate tribes into a single, unified society. In the heart of this expansion, the city of Saffron emerged as a beacon of the mind and a crossroads for all who traversed the land. It was a place where the air felt charged with a different kind of energy, not the raw elemental power of the mountains or the sea, but the focused, vibrant current of human thought. The early thinkers of Saffron turned their gaze inward, exploring the depths of intuition and the unseen connections between spirits. They built structures of precision and symmetry, creating an environment that encouraged study and reflection. It was here that the first formal exchanges between different disciplines took place, as scholars from the stoneworks of the north met with the herbalists of the central forests. Saffron became the intellectual anchor of the region, a place where the mysteries of the world were debated under the soft glow of the lanterns, and where the first maps of the spiritual landscape were drafted. Meanwhile, the coastal town of Vermilion grew into a bustling gateway, its docks reaching out like wooden fingers toward the infinite horizon of the sea. The people of the coast were the voyagers and the dreamers, their lives dictated by the rising and falling of the tides. They learned to build vessels that could navigate the unpredictable currents, bringing back stories of distant islands and the strange, beautiful beings that inhabited the deep. Vermilion was a place of constant motion, where the air was always salt-heavy and filled with the cries of the winged ones that followed the ships. The city served as a reminder that the land was not an isolated kingdom, but part of a much larger, interconnected world. The relationship between the people and the ocean was one of deep reverence. They understood that the same water that provided their bounty also held the power to reclaim the shore at a moment's notice. To the south, the island of Cinnabar remained a place of isolation and intense study, its volcanic peaks providing a natural hearth for those who sought to uncover the origins of existence. On this island, the fire was not an enemy to be feared, but a teacher to be respected. The early inhabitants of Cinnabar were the keepers of the deep heat, learning to harness the subterranean energy to fuel their inquiries into the history of life. They were fascinated by the traces left behind by the ancients, the secrets locked within the fossils and the cooling lava. The atmosphere on the island was one of quiet, focused observation, a contrast to the busy streets of the mainland. It was a place where the physical laws of the world were most visible, and where the boundary between the living present and the prehistoric past was thinnest. In the midst of this urban growth, the town of Celadon became the emerald jewel of the Central Plains, a sanctuary where the flora of the region was celebrated with unparalleled devotion. The city was designed as a series of interconnected gardens, where the scent of blooming flowers was so thick it could be felt as a physical presence. The people of Celadon were the masters of growth and healing, developing a deep understanding of the medicinal properties held within every leaf and root. They believed that the health of the community was inextricably tied to the health of the land, and they treated their gardens as sacred spaces. The city was a testament to the idea that civilization did not have to mean the erasure of nature. Rather, it could be a way to cultivate and amplify the beauty that was already there. As these cities reached their maturity, a formal structure of guardianship began to take shape. The individuals who demonstrated the deepest connection to the elemental forces were recognized as the stewards of their respective domains. These guardians were the keepers of the balance, ensuring that the growth of the cities did not outpace the resilience of the ecosystem. Their role was both practical and spiritual, acting as mediators between the human world and the wild world. To seek the guidance of a guardian was a significant journey, requiring a traveler to prove their sincerity and their respect for the natural order. This system provided a stabilizing force for the region, creating a sense of continuity that allowed the culture to thrive even as the challenges of the world grew more complex. However, the shadows of ambition were also beginning to lengthen. As the ability to harness the energy of the world increased, so did the temptation to use that power for personal gain. There were those who began to view the Pokémon not as spiritual partners, but as tools for dominance. These flickers of discord were subtle at first. A forest grove that grew silent too soon, or a mountain pass where the stones felt cold and unwelcoming. The ancient harmony was being tested by a new kind of pragmatism, one that valued control over cooperation. This tension was felt by the sensitive and the wise, a low vibration beneath the busy surface of city life. The era of pure innocence was drawing to a close, and the region was preparing to enter a period of trial where the strength of its foundations would be measured against the weight of its own success. The landscape itself seemed to reflect this shifting mood. The legendary guardians of the air and the fire were seen less often, retreating to the heights and the depths where the influence of man was least felt. Their absence left the world feeling a little quieter, a little more fragile. The humans continued to build and explore, but there was a growing awareness that the gifts of the land were not inexhaustible. The stories told by the wanderers shifted from tales of wonder to stories of caution, reminding the listeners that the balance of Kanto was a delicate thing, held together by the thin threads of respect and memory. The bright light of the day was beginning to settle into a long, reflective afternoon, and the region stood at the threshold of a new chapter, one that would be written in the deeds of those who chose to protect the ancient flame. As the cities of the region grew in stature and influence, the early harmony of the world began to face its first true era of complexity. The transition from scattered settlements to a structured society brought with it a shift in how the people perceived the very creatures that shared their lives. In the past, the relationship had been one of mutual survival, but now it evolved into a sophisticated partnership. This period saw the formal establishment of the Guardians' domains, where the most seasoned keepers of the elemental balance took up residence in the hearts of the great cities. They were no longer just village elders. They were the living symbols of their respective elements. In Pewter, the Guardians stood as firm as the granite of the surrounding peaks, while in Cerulean, the guardianship took on the fluid, ever-changing nature of the coastal tides. This was the birth of a system meant to preserve the spirit of the land, ensuring that as humanity advanced, it did not lose its soul to the cold efficiency of progress. In the center of this burgeoning civilization, the rise of Saffron City brought about a new kind of industry. The collective known as Sylph began to bridge the gap between ancient understanding and modern craft, creating tools that allowed the people to interact with the world in ways previously unimagined. They sought to understand the very essence of the life force that moved through the Pokémon, attempting to categorize and quantify the invisible threads of energy that bound the region together. While much of this work was born from a place of curiosity and a desire to help, it also introduced a layer of distance. The raw, direct connection of the early wanderers began to be replaced by the precision of instruments and the logic of architecture. The city itself became a labyrinth of innovation, its streets humming with a quiet, persistent energy that seemed to vibrate even in the deepest hours of the night. Far to the south, the island of Cinnabar became the site of even more profound inquiries. Surrounded by the warmth of the volcanic vents and the isolation of the sea, a community of researchers delved into the deep history of the Earth. They were not satisfied with the stories told around campfires. They sought the physical truth of the prehistoric era. They recovered the remains of beings that had been lost to time, creatures of stone and sky that had vanished long before the first human footsteps marked the sand. The laboratories of Cinnabar were places of hushed reverence and intense focus, where the scent of ozone and ancient dust hung heavy in the air. Here, the boundary between the past and the present was treated not as a wall, but as a door that could, with enough knowledge, be nudged open. This curiosity was a testament to the human spirit, but it also carried a weight of responsibility that few fully understood at the time. In the shadows of this progress, a different kind of movement was beginning to coalesce. Not all who lived in the cities or walked the paths felt the same reverence for the ancient balance. Within the darkened alleyways of the larger metropolises and the forgotten corners of the great forests, a collective of a darker nature began to form. This organization, led by those who saw the world as a game of influence and control, began to treat the Pokémon of the region as commodities rather than companions. Their ideology was simple and cold. Power belonged to those who could take it. They operated in the hidden spaces, creating a network of influence that stretched from the busy docks of Vermilion to the quiet outskirts of Celadon. They were the first to look upon the legendary guardians not as protectors to be honored, but as obstacles to be overcome or assets to be claimed. The town of Lavender stood as a silent witness to these shifting tides. While the rest of the region raced toward the future, Lavender remained anchored in the past and the transition beyond life. The Pokémon Tower grew taller, its stone walls absorbing the prayers and memories of 1,000 years. The air in the town was always cool, a contrast to the heat of the industrial centers. It was a place of deep, heavy quiet, where the spirits of the departed were said to congregate in the mist. The people of Lavender understood something that the researchers of Cinnabar and the innovators of Saffron often forgot: that all things, no matter how powerful, must eventually return to the earth. The tower served as a moral anchor for the region, a vertical reminder of the consequences of one's actions and the weight of the bonds formed in life. The tension between the traditional ways and the new ambitions created a quiet friction that permeated the land. The wandering figures of the roads, those who traveled from town to town with no fixed home, felt this change most acutely. They saw the way the wild places were shrinking and the way the herds moved with a new kind of nervousness. They noticed the subtle shifts in the weather, the storms that felt a little more violent, the frosts that lingered a little too long. It was as if the land itself was aware of the encroaching discord. These wanderers became the unofficial messengers of the region, carrying news of the changing world and reminding the people of the cities that they were still part of a larger, breathing ecosystem. Their role was to maintain the connection, to ensure that the stories of the ancients were not drowned out by the noise of the machines. In the northern reaches, the Indigo Plateau remained the ultimate goal for those who sought to prove their understanding of the world. It was the highest point of authority, a place where the most powerful defenders of the region resided. These individuals, known for their mastery and their wisdom, were the final arbiters of the balance. To reach them was a task of immense difficulty, requiring a traveler to have passed through the trials of the various guardians across the land. The plateau was a place of thin air and biting wind, a stark, beautiful summit that overlooked the entire Kanto region. From its heights, one could see the forests, the oceans, and the cities spread out like a map of human endeavor. It stood as a symbol of the pinnacle of achievement, a reminder that true power was not just about strength, but about the elevation of the spirit. As the era of expansion reached its height, the first flickers of open conflict began to appear. The organization operating in the shadows grew more bold, their activities moving from the periphery into the heart of the community. Reports of strange experiments and the forced gathering of Pokémon began to circulate. The peace that had defined the region for generations was starting to fray at the edges. The legendary guardians of the elements, the birds of ice, fire, and thunder, were heard crying out from their distant retreats, their voices echoing through the canyons and across the seas. The world was standing on the precipice of a great trial, a test that would determine whether the harmony of the past could survive the pressures of the modern age. The long afternoon was fading, and the first stars of a turbulent evening were beginning to shine. As the shadows of the underground collective deepened, the atmosphere across the Kanto region began to change, shifting from the vibrant energy of progress to a state of guarded vigilance. The organization, known in whispers as a force of absolute control, had begun to exert its influence over the very lifelines of the region. They were no longer content with small-scale trafficking. They sought to dominate the intersection of technology and biology. In the heart of the great cities, the presence of these figures became a common, if unsettling, sight. They moved with a cold precision, their eyes devoid of the warmth that usually defined the bond between human and Pokémon. To them, the creatures of the land were no longer symbols of nature's grace, but assets to be tallied, exploited, and reshaped to suit a singular, dark ambition. This period marked the rise of the great technological silos, where the ancient mysteries were dismantled in the name of efficiency. In the laboratories of the central cities, the silent language of the spirit was being translated into the cold mathematics of the machine. While many researchers still worked with noble intent, the encroaching influence of the criminal organization began to warp their study. They sought to push the boundaries of what was naturally possible, questioning the limits of evolution and the sanctity of the genetic code. The air in these facilities was sterile and hummed with the constant drone of cooling fans, a stark contrast to the rustling leaves of the wild. The world was witnessing the first true attempts to separate the power of the Pokémon from the balance of nature, a severance that sent ripples of unease through the earth itself. In the forest of Celadon, the keepers of the gardens noticed that the vibrant flora began to lose its luster. The scents of the blossoms grew faint, and the creatures within the canopy moved with a frantic energy. The organization had begun encroaching upon these sanctuaries, seeing the abundance of life as a buffet for their experiments. They established hidden outposts beneath the city's streets, where the light of the sun never reached and the only sounds were the clicking of locks and the low thrum of industrial equipment. This was the beginning of the Great Corruption, a time when the beauty of the region started to be veiled by a layer of moral ambiguity. The people of the city began to close their doors and speak in hushed tones, sensing that the very ground beneath them was being hollowed out. Meanwhile, in the bustling port of Vermilion, the salt air was increasingly tainted by the smell of burning coal and the cold tang of iron. The organization realized that to control the region, they must control its gates. They began to monitor the ships that arrived from distant seas, looking for rare and powerful specimens to add to their growing arsenal. The docks became a place of suspicion, where the friendly exchange of stories was replaced by the wary glances of traders. The wandering figures, who once found a warm welcome in the taverns, now found themselves under the watchful eyes of those who served the collective's interests. The sea itself seemed to react, with the tides growing erratic and the great aquatic dwellers retreating further into the lightless depths of the ocean. The legendary guardians of the three elements, ice, lightning, and fire, remained in their distant retreats, but their presence was felt in a more urgent way. The storms that swept across the plains carried an edge of fury, and the snows of the mountains fell with a weight that felt like a warning. It was as if the elemental spirits were mourning the loss of the harmony they had spent eons maintaining. The guardians of the cities, the stewards of the gyms, stood as the final line of defense. They began to tighten the requirements for those who sought their guidance, looking for individuals who possessed not just strength, but an unyielding integrity. They knew the coming conflict would not be won by power alone, but by the purity of the connection between the spirit and the land. In the quiet village of Pallet, the shift was felt as a subtle loss of light. The rolling hills remained green, but the sense of boundless potential was being replaced by a somber realization of the stakes. The chroniclers of the mundane recorded the signs of the region's distress. They saw how migrating birds changed their routes to avoid industrial centers, and how spring blossoms opened later and closed earlier. They understood that the struggle for Kanto was not just a battle for territory, but a fight for the right to coexist with the world as it was intended. The town became a place of quiet preparation, a sanctuary for the traditional wisdom that would be desperately needed in the days to come. The organization's reach eventually extended even toward the heights of the Indigo Plateau. While the defenders there remained beyond direct control, the collective sought to undermine the authority of the system from below. They began to sponsor their own agents, individuals trained to prioritize dominance above all else. These agents moved through the region with an arrogance that mirrored their masters, challenging the traditional guardians and mocking the values of the old world. The very concept of the journey was being transformed into a competitive race for status. The tension reached a fever pitch as the people looked toward the horizon, wondering if the light of the morning would ever return to a land so shrouded in ambition and greed. Beneath the surface of this turmoil, the most ambitious project of the organization was nearing its completion. In a hidden facility, far from prying eyes, they worked to create a being that would consolidate all the power of the ancient world into a single form. They used fragments of the past and the essence of the mythic entity that had witnessed the birth of the region. This was the ultimate transgression, the attempt to play at creation without the wisdom of the ages. The air in this secret laboratory was thick with the scent of chemicals and the hum of immense power. The result of this experiment would become the catalyst for the greatest trial the region had ever faced, a manifestation of both high achievement and deep failure. The world was now standing in the twilight of an era. The structures of the cities remained, and the paths still connected the towns, but the spirit of Kanto was in a state of quiet rebellion. The harmony of the past felt like a distant memory, a story told to children to comfort them in the dark. Yet, even in this gloom, there were those who refused to let the flame of the ancient ways go out. They were the ones who still walked the forests without tools, who still spoke to the wind, and who still believed that the bond between human and Pokémon was something that could never be truly quantified. They were the keepers of the hidden light, waiting for the moment when the shadows would finally be forced to face the dawn. In the depths of the Indigo Mountains, where the air grows thin and the wind carries the chill of the eternal snows, the regional guardians began to sense the shifting weight of the world. The Indigo Plateau had always been more than a destination for travelers. It was the spiritual heart of Kanto's balance, a place where the most disciplined minds stood watch over the land's destiny. The Elite Four, as they were known in the oldest scrolls, were not merely champions of strength, but the protectors of a legacy that reached back to the very first sunrise. They watched from their high towers as the shadows of the southern cities grew long and the industrial thrum of saffron and vermilion began to pulse with a discordant rhythm. They felt the disturbance in the elemental currents. The ice grew brittle, the lightning flickered with agitation, and the volcanic fires of the south burned with a restless, angry heat. The corruption brought by the underground organization was no longer a series of isolated incidents. It had become a systematic unraveling of the region's foundations. In the sprawling metropolis of Saffron, the Sylph organization found itself under a subtle but suffocating pressure. The innovations that were once meant to bring humans and Pokémon closer together were being repurposed into tools of containment and coercion. The very air in the city felt heavy, as if the collective psychic energy of the residents was being dampened by the metallic influence of the collective. The streets, once vibrant with the exchange of ideas, became corridors of silence where eyes were cast downward and conversations were kept brief. The organization had realized that knowledge was a form of power, and they sought to monopolize the wisdom of the region's greatest thinkers, turning Saffron into a gilded cage for the intellect. To the east, the quiet town of Lavender became a site of profound spiritual struggle. The Pokémon Tower, once a place of pure memory and peaceful transition, began to vibrate with a restless energy. The organization, seeking to understand the nature of the spirit beyond the physical form, had dared to breach the sanctity of the tower's higher reaches. They sought to harness the energy of the spectral beings, viewing the echoes of the past as nothing more than a source of untamed power. This transgression disturbed the long-slumbering spirits, and a thick, unnatural fog began to roll through the streets of Lavender, carrying with it a sense of profound grief and agitation. The bells of the tower rang without hands to pull the ropes, their mournful peals echoing across the coastline as a warning that some boundaries were never meant to be crossed. Amidst this encroaching darkness, the figure of the mythic wanderer took on a new significance. These were the individuals who refused to be bound by the dictates of the collective or the fear of the cities. They continued to walk the ancient paths, their presence serving as a reminder of the bond that once defined the land. They carried the stories of the green valleys of Pallet and the rocky heights of Pewter into the shadowed hearts of the industrial centers. Their journey was no longer just a personal quest for understanding. It was an act of defiance against the cold pragmatism of the age. They became the keepers of the region's memory, ensuring that the names of the legendary birds and the origin myths of the first ancients were not forgotten in the rush toward a synthetic future. In the hidden laboratory beneath the volcanic crust of Cinnabar, the organization's greatest project was reaching its final, volatile stage. They had moved beyond the study of fossils and into the realm of active creation. Using the genetic echoes of the mythic ancestor, the shimmering entity that held the potential of all life, they were stitching together a being of unprecedented psychic and physical power. This creature was not born of nature's slow, deliberate process, but of the human desire for a perfect vessel of command. The air in the facility was constantly ionized, crackling with a power that the machines could barely contain. The scientists, driven by a mixture of fear and pride, watched as the form took shape within the containment glass, unaware that the spirit they were attempting to manufacture possessed a consciousness far more complex and tormented than they could ever control. The region's geography itself began to reflect this internal conflict. The Great Marsh of the South became more treacherous, its waters murky and its inhabitants more aggressive as the chemical runoff from the industrial sites seeped into the soil. The mountains of the north seemed to pull away from the valleys, their peaks obscured by a perpetual shroud of gray clouds. Even the sea, once the provider of life for the coast of Cerulean, began to churn with a restless energy that made the old sailors wary. The harmony that had been maintained for eons was fracturing, and the land was speaking its distress through the language of the elements. The people of the smaller villages, like the pastoral community of Fuchsia, fortified their boundaries and turned back to the ancient ways of protection, relying on the natural defenses of the terrain and the instincts of their Pokémon companions. The leadership of the criminal organization remained shrouded in mystery, operating through a series of intermediaries and hidden commands. Yet, the influence of a single, calculating mind was felt in every strategic move. They understood that to truly own Kanto, they had to dismantle the system of the regional guardians. They began to challenge the authority of the gyms, not through honorable combat, but through economic pressure and the infiltration of the guardians' inner circles. Some of the stewards held firm, their spirits as unyielding as the elements they represented, while others felt the weight of the changing world and began to doubt the relevance of their ancient roles. This internal erosion was perhaps the most dangerous threat of all, as it threatened to destroy the moral framework that had guided the region since its inception. As the long evening of the expansion era deepened into a night of uncertainty, the stars above Kanto seemed to shine with a cold, distant light. The world was waiting for a catalyst, a moment of reckoning where the forces of the old ways and the ambitions of the new would finally collide. The tension had reached a point where even a single spark could ignite a conflagration that would reshape the region forever. The mythic wanderers, the keepers of the tower, and the defenders of the high plateau all looked toward the horizon, sensing that the time of quiet observation was coming to an end. The story of Kanto was moving toward its most difficult chapter, a period of trial and transformation that would test the heart of every living being in the land. The secret project on Cinnabar was nearly complete, and the echoes of its first conscious thoughts began to ripple through the psychic landscape of the region. It was a mind filled with questions and a deep, underlying sorrow, a being created for power but yearning for a purpose that its creators could never provide. This internal awakening was the final sign that the era of control was an illusion, and that the nature of life would always find a way to assert its own path. The stage was set for the fall of the shadows and the difficult journey back toward the light, a journey that would require the courage of the few to restore the balance for the many. In the hidden heart of the Cinnabar laboratories, the silence was finally broken by the first true pulse of a manufactured life. This being, an entity of silver and violet light, was the culmination of every ambition the underground organization had ever nurtured. It was meant to be the ultimate instrument of their will, a creature unbound by the traditional limitations of nature and superior to the ancient spirits of the wild. Yet, as the life support systems hummed and the glowing containment fluids swirled, the consciousness within did not awaken with the cold obedience its creators expected. Instead, it awoke with a profound and agonizing awareness of its own isolation. It felt the stolen fragments of the mythic ancestor within its veins, the echoes of a being that once danced in sunlit canopies, but it saw only cold steel. Its first thoughts were not of conquest, but of a deep existential sorrow, a questioning of why it had been called from the void into a world of glass and calculation. Outside the laboratory walls, the region began to feel the psychic weight of this awakening. In Saffron City, the sensitive felt a sudden, sharp tremor in the air, a vibration that disrupted the steady hum of the Sylph machinery. It was as if a new star had appeared in the mental firmament, one that burned with a fierce, cold intensity. The organization's leaders celebrated, believing they had finally grasped the reins of destiny. But the common folk felt a growing sense of dread. The weather around Cinnabar turned erratic. Volcanic vents hissed with unusual pressure, and seabirds fled the rocky shores in frantic flocks. The air became thick with the scent of ozone and heated metal, a physical manifestation of the psychic storm brewing beneath the earth. The balance of Kanto, already frayed by years of industrial corruption, was now being pulled toward a point of total transformation. This period saw the organization's influence reach its absolute peak. Emboldened by their success, they moved to solidify control over the central hubs. Their agents took up permanent positions in the shadows of the cerulean bridges and the darkened corners of the saffron skyscrapers. They no longer hid their intentions, operating with a cold arrogance that suggested the time for secrecy had passed. They began to implement a system of total monitoring, using technology to track the movements of every wanderer and every herd. The freedom of the road, which had been the lifeblood of Kanto for generations, was being systematically choked. People looked to the regional guardians for a sign of resistance, but even the great gymnasiums felt the pressure, their halls growing quiet as the stewards struggled to counter a threat that moved through the very fabric of the modern world. In the forest of Celadon, the deterioration became visible to even the most casual observer. The great trees, which had stood for centuries as monuments to the region's vitality, began to drop their leaves out of season. The water in the city's fountains turned stagnant, no longer carrying the energy of the mountain springs. The organization had begun to divert natural currents to power their networks, leaving the emerald heart of Kanto parched. Keepers of the gardens worked tirelessly to save what they could, but they were fighting against a tide of industrial greed that cared nothing for the delicate cycles of growth and decay. It was a somber time for the residents of the city, who watched as the colors of their home faded into shades of gray and brown, a visual reflection of the moral decay spreading through the land. Lavender Town became a sanctuary for those who sought to escape the encroaching influence of the collective. The fog that surrounded the Pokémon Tower grew dense, acting as a natural barrier against mechanical intrusion. The spirits of the departed seemed to rise in a collective defense of their resting place, their presence creating an atmosphere so heavy with memory that agents found it impossible to remain there for long. The bells of the tower continued their rhythmic tolling, a sound that carried across the plains as a heartbeat for the resistance. Within the tower's walls, old stories were being told with new urgency, as the keepers of the spirit recognized that the memory of the past was the only weapon that could not be taken from them. They waited and watched, knowing that artificial light could never truly replace the eternal glow of the spirit. Mythic wanderers, sensing the shift in the world's pulse, began to converge on hidden paths leading toward the southern islands. They moved with quiet purpose, avoiding the main roads and the watchful eyes of the collective's monitors. They were drawn by the psychic resonance emanating from Cinnabar, a call that spoke of both great danger and tragic necessity. Among them were individuals who had seen the rise and fall of many cycles, and they knew the entity born of the laboratory was not a monster to be destroyed, but a mirror of their own ambitions. Their goal was to find a way to integrate this new being into the ancient tapestry of the land, to turn a manufactured tragedy into a path toward redemption. Their journey was slow and fraught with peril, as the land itself seemed to be in the throes of a fevered dream. Beneath the surface of Cinnabar, tensions within the laboratory reached a breaking point. The entity, which the creators called by a cold, numerical designation, was no longer content to remain a passive observer. It began to test the limits of its containment, its psychic reach extending into the minds of the scientists. It saw their fears and their petty desires, and it grew to loathe the hands that had crafted its form. It realized its power was not a gift, but a burden stolen from the mythic past. The walls of the facility started to crack under the pressure of its burgeoning will, and the machines groaned as they tried to dampen an energy fundamentally incompatible with their logic. The air in the chamber became a swirling vortex of violet light, a premonition of the release soon to come. As the world waited on the edge of this cataclysm, the three legendary birds of the elements took flight. Articuno moved through the northern clouds, shedding a fine frost that calmed the agitated winds. Zapdos circled the central plains, grounding the erratic electrical storms that had plagued the cities. Moltres flew toward the south, its plumage casting a warm, protective glow over the volcanic islands. They were the ancient antibodies of the region, reacting to the infection of the artificial creation. They did not come to fight, but to witness the arrival and to ensure the fundamental laws of the world were not entirely unraveled. The sky over Kanto was filled with the brilliance of these celestial guardians, a final display of the natural order before the new era. The moment of release finally came with a silent, blinding flash that leveled the facility and sent a psychic shockwave across the region. The being emerged from the ruins, a creature of pure, unbridled energy standing amidst the wreckage of human ambition. It looked up at the stars, seeing them for the first time without the interference of glass. It was free, but entirely alone, a singular existence in a world that did not know how to receive it. The organization's hold on Cinnabar was shattered in an instant, their technology rendered useless by the intensity of the awakening. Kanto had entered a territory where nothing was certain, and where the future would be decided by the heart of a being that was never meant to exist. In the aftermath of the cataclysm on Cinnabar, a heavy silence settled over the region. The psychic shockwave left the land in a state of stunned reflection. The entity released from the ruins did not immediately descend as a conqueror. Instead, it sought sanctuary in the deepest, most inaccessible places. It found its way to the winding corridors of a great cavern in the north, where the air was cold and the stone was ancient. There, amidst the stalactites and the whispering echoes of the earth, the being began to contemplate its existence. It was a creature of immense power, but also of profound isolation, carrying the weight of a heritage it had not chosen and a purpose it had yet to define. While the entity sought solitude, the underground organization was thrown into disarray. The destruction of their primary facility was a blow to their pride, but their ambition remained. They tightened their grip on the central hubs, desperate to salvage their research. In Saffron City, the Sylph structures were put under lockdown, and the streets were patrolled by agents moving with increased urgency. The organization realized they had created something they could not control, and their fear manifested as a desire for even greater dominance. They began to look toward the other legendary forces of the region, wondering if the ancient birds or the spirits of the tower could be used to counter the very being they had brought into the world. The regional guardians began to coordinate their efforts for the first time in generations. The stewards of the gyms recognized that the era of isolation was over. They began to share their wisdom and strength, forming a unified front against the encroaching shadow. They were no longer just protectors of their local domains. They were the defenders of the region's soul. They looked toward the Indigo Plateau, where the highest authorities stood in silent vigil, waiting for the moment when the balance would finally be tipped. The tension was no longer a quiet vibration. It was an open struggle for the future of the land, pitting ancient values of harmony against a modern hunger for authority. In the quiet town of Pallet, news of the disaster was received with sorrow and resolve. The chroniclers understood that the awakening of the new entity was the inevitable result of a path that had begun long ago, when humanity first sought to master the mysteries of life. They gathered their scrolls, preparing for the role they would play. They knew that the strength needed to restore balance would not come from machines, but from the simple, enduring bond between the spirit and the land. They watched the horizon for the arrival of the wandering figures who would eventually serve as the catalysts for the region's redemption. Lavender Town became the focal point for the spiritual resonance of the region. The fog surrounding the Pokémon Tower began to glow with a soft, ethereal light, as if memories of the past were being activated by the presence of the new entity. The spirits of the departed were no longer restless. They were expectant. The bells of the tower rang with a deep tone that could be heard for miles, grounding the psychic energy of the land. The people of Lavender realized their role as keepers of transition was more important than ever, providing a sanctuary for those displaced by industrial corruption. The three legendary birds maintained their vigil, their flights becoming more frequent and visible. They were the elemental anchors, ensuring that the fundamental laws of the world remained intact. They were seen circling the heights of the Indigo Plateau and the depths of the southern seas, their cries echoing through the valleys as a reminder of the forces that existed before the first cities. They did not intervene in the human struggle, but their mere existence served as a check on the ambitions of the organization. They were silent witnesses to the unraveling of the old order and the slow, painful birth of the new. As weeks passed, the entity in the northern cavern began to reach out with its mind, sensing the thoughts of the world it had inherited. It felt the greed of the organization and the fear of the city dwellers, but it also felt the unadulterated joy of the wild herds and the loyalty of the companions who walked the paths. These glimpses of a different existence began to soften its loathing. It realized that while its birth was a tragedy, its life did not have to be defined by the hands of its creators. It began to seek a way to use its power not for destruction, but for the preservation of the world that had offered it only pain. The geography of Kanto shifted in response to this turmoil. Pathways through the mountains became more rugged and forests grew more dense, as if the land itself was trying to protect the innocent. Rivers flowed with renewed vigor, carrying the purity of the mountains into the parched central plains. It was a time of great environmental intensity, where every storm felt like a significant event. The people of smaller villages found themselves more connected to the rhythms of nature, rediscovering the traditional wisdom that had been sidelined by the rush toward industry. The organization made a final, desperate move to seize control of the Sylph Collective in Saffron. They realized that without the technological infrastructure of the city, their influence would eventually wither. They occupied the central towers, turning the once vibrant center of innovation into a fortress of shadow. This act of open aggression was the signal that the period of quiet corruption had ended. The people of Saffron, led by a secret resistance of thinkers, began to fight back from within, setting the stage for a conflict that would determine the fate of the region's most important hub. The world was now in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the final collision. The entity in the cavern, the guardians on the plateau, and the wanderers on the road were all moving toward a singular point of intersection. The story of Kanto was no longer just a history of expansion. It had become a mythic struggle for the right to exist in harmony. The shadows were at their longest, but in the distance, the first hints of a different kind of light were beginning to appear, born from the enduring resilience of the living heart. In the aftermath of the cataclysm on Cinnabar, a heavy silence settled over the region. The psychic shockwave left the land in a state of stunned reflection. The entity released from the ruins did not immediately descend as a conqueror. Instead, it sought sanctuary in the deepest, most inaccessible places. It found its way to the winding corridors of a great cavern in the north, where the air was cold and the stone was ancient. There, amidst the stalactites and the whispering echoes of the earth, the being began to contemplate its existence. It was a creature of immense power, but also of profound isolation, carrying the weight of a heritage it had not chosen and a purpose it had yet to define. While the entity sought solitude, the underground organization was thrown into disarray. The destruction of their primary facility was a blow to their pride, but their ambition remained. They tightened their grip on the central hubs, desperate to salvage their research. In Saffron City, the Sylph structures were put under lockdown, and the streets were patrolled by agents moving with increased urgency. The organization realized they had created something they could not control, and their fear manifested as a desire for even greater dominance. They began to look toward the other legendary forces of the region, wondering if the ancient birds or the spirits of the tower could be used to counter the very being they had brought into the world. The regional guardians began to coordinate their efforts for the first time in generations. The stewards of the gyms recognized that the era of isolation was over. They began to share their wisdom and strength, forming a unified front against the encroaching shadow. They were no longer just protectors of their local domains. They were the defenders of the region's soul. They looked toward the Indigo Plateau, where the highest authorities stood in silent vigil, waiting for the moment when the balance would finally be tipped. The tension was no longer a quiet vibration. It was an open struggle for the future of the land, pitting ancient values of harmony against a modern hunger for authority. In the quiet town of Pallet, news of the disaster was received with sorrow and resolve. The chroniclers understood that the awakening of the new entity was the inevitable result of a path that had begun long ago. They gathered their scrolls, preparing for the role they would play. They knew that the strength needed to restore balance would not come from machines, but from the simple, enduring bond between the spirit and the land. They watched the horizon for the arrival of the wandering figures who would eventually serve as the catalysts for the region's redemption. Lavender Town became the focal point for the spiritual resonance of the region. The fog surrounding the Pokémon Tower began to glow with a soft, ethereal light. The spirits of the departed were no longer restless. They were expectant. The bells of the tower rang with a deep tone that could be heard for miles, grounding the psychic energy of the land. The people of Lavender realized their role as keepers of transition was more important than ever, providing a sanctuary for those displaced by industrial corruption. The three legendary birds maintained their vigil, their flights becoming more frequent and visible. They were the elemental anchors, ensuring that the fundamental laws of the world remained intact. They were seen circling the heights of the Indigo Plateau and the depths of the southern seas, their cries echoing through the valleys as a reminder of the forces that existed before the first cities. They did not intervene in the human struggle, but their existence served as a check on the ambitions of the organization. They were silent witnesses to the unraveling of the old order and the slow, painful birth of the new. As weeks passed, the entity in the northern cavern began to reach out with its mind, sensing the thoughts of the world. It felt the greed of the organization, but it also felt the unadulterated joy of the wild herds and the loyalty of the companions who walked the paths. These glimpses of a different existence began to soften its loathing. It realized that while its birth was a tragedy, its life did not have to be defined by the hands of its creators. It began to seek a way to use its power not for destruction, but for the preservation of the world that had offered it only pain. The geography of Kanto shifted in response to this turmoil. Pathways through the mountains became more rugged and forests grew more dense, as if the land itself was trying to protect the innocent. Rivers flowed with renewed vigor, carrying the purity of the mountains into the central plains. It was a time of great environmental intensity, where every storm felt like a significant event. The people of smaller villages found themselves more connected to nature, rediscovering the traditional wisdom that had been sidelined by industry. The organization made a final, desperate move to seize control of the Sylph Collective in Saffron. They realized that without the technological infrastructure of the city, their influence would eventually wither. They occupied the central towers, turning the once vibrant center of innovation into a fortress of shadow. This act of open aggression was the signal that the period of quiet corruption had ended. The people of Saffron, led by a secret resistance of thinkers, began to fight back from within, setting the stage for a conflict that would determine the fate of the region's most important hub. The world was now in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the final collision. The entity in the cavern, the guardians on the plateau, and the wanderers on the road were all moving toward a singular point of intersection. The story of Kanto was no longer just a history of expansion. It had become a mythic struggle for the right to exist in harmony. The shadows were at their longest, but in the distance, the first hints of a different kind of light were beginning to appear, born from the enduring resilience of the living heart. In the quiet, pre-dawn hours of a new era, the town of Pallet sat as a silent sanctuary on the edge of the world's uncertainty. While the great cities of Saffron and Vermilion were gripped by the tension of the collective's expansion, the air in this southern haven remained cool and untainted. It was a place where the history of the region felt present in every blade of grass and every rhythmic swell of the sea. The laboratory that stood on the hill, overlooking the pastoral fields, was not a place of industrial calculation, but of quiet observation and profound respect. Within its walls, the chroniclers of the mundane and the seekers of truth continued their work, documenting the subtle shifts in the land's heartbeat. They knew that the era of the great guardians and the artificial shadows was reaching a climax, and that the next chapter of the Kanto story would be written not by the powerful, but by the pure of heart. The atmosphere in Pallet was one of expectant stillness, a transition between the old world of myth and the new world of individual discovery. The elders of the village spoke in hushed tones of the ancient bonds, reminding the youth that the relationship between human and Pokémon was a sacred trust, not a tool for dominance. They watched the children of the village with a mixture of hope and trepidation, knowing that soon, the time would come for them to step onto the paths that connected the regions. These paths were no longer just routes for trade. They were the arteries of a recovering world, waiting for the arrival of those who would heal the fractures caused by the industrial corruption. The village was a cradle of potential, a small point of light in a landscape that was still struggling to find its balance after the psychic shock of the Cinnabar release. In the northern reaches, the entity within the cavern had begun to settle into its role as the silent observer of the region's psyche. It no longer reached out with anger, but with a deep, analytical curiosity. It felt the shift in the winds and the movement of the migratory herds, realizing that the land was preparing for a renewal. The three legendary birds had returned to their hidden sanctuaries, their presence a steadying force that kept the elemental currents from spiraling into chaos. The guardians of the cities, having formed their unified front, stood ready to challenge the final remnants of the organization's influence. The stage was set for a convergence of forces that would determine whether the future of Kanto would be defined by the cold logic of the machine or the warm, unpredictable spirit of the living. The organization, now entrenched within the metallic heart of Saffron City, felt the walls of their influence closing in. Their occupation of the Sylph Towers had become a symbol of their desperation rather than their strength. The resistance from within the city was growing, fueled by the knowledge that the ancient harmony of the land was more resilient than any synthetic network. The leaders of the collective, blinded by their hunger for absolute authority, failed to see that the world was moving past them. They were a relic of a dying philosophy, a shadow that the rising sun would eventually disperse. Their focus remained on the high plateau and the legendary secrets, unaware that the true threat to their power was stirring in a humble coastal village far to the south. As the first light of a significant morning began to crest over the eastern mountains, a singular house in Pallet Town stood bathed in the soft, golden glow. Inside, the preparations for a journey were being made with a quiet, nervous energy. This was not the journey of a soldier or a scholar, but of a dreamer. A 10-year-old boy whose vision of the world was still shaped by wonder rather than ambition. His room was filled with the artifacts of his fascination. Maps of the region, books on the habits of the forest dwellers, and the simple tools of a wanderer. The clock on the wall ticked toward the hour of departure, marking the end of his childhood and the beginning of a role that had been foretold in the movements of the stars and the whispers of the wind. The weight of the region's history seemed to lean into this moment. The story of the primordial shaping, the rise of the first ancients, the creation of the artificial being, and the struggle against the dark collective were all threads leading to this single point of intersection. The boy, unaware of the mythic scale of the forces surrounding him, was simply focused on the excitement of the path ahead. He did not yet know of the psychic entity in the cave or the legendary guardians on their peaks. He knew only that the world was vast and beautiful, and that somewhere out there, a partner was waiting for him, a companion who would share his burdens and his triumphs. The innocence of his intent was the very thing the land had been waiting for, a catalyst that could bypass the complications of the modern age and return to the heart of the original bond. Down the hill, in the laboratory, the head chronicler prepared the final gifts for the traveler. These were not weapons, but windows into the world, devices that would help the boy record his discoveries and understand the diversity of the life he would encounter. The chronicler looked out the window toward the rising sun, sensing that the period of quiet observation was over. The time had come for the knowledge of the past to be tested by the actions of the present. He knew that the boy's journey would be difficult, filled with the shadows of the organization and the trials of the elemental guardians. But he also knew that the boy carried with him the resilience of the living heart that had sustained Kanto since the first sunrise. The town of Pallet breathed out a long, collective sigh as the sun fully emerged, illuminating the path that led toward the north. The air was crisp and filled with the scent of sea salt and blooming flowers, a reminder of the purity that still existed at the edges of civilization. The restless energy of the previous weeks had settled into a steady, focused purpose. The land was ready. The Pokémon were ready. The story of Kanto was about to transition from a history of legends into a narrative of experience. The boy, waking to the realization that he had overslept the appointed hour, rushed toward his destiny with a frantic, joyful energy that was the perfect antithesis to the cold precision of his enemies. This was the moment of the great alignment. The psychic entity in the cave felt a spark of new energy on the horizon, a flicker of light that was different from the ambitious minds of the scientists. The legendary birds tilted their wings in the high currents, sensing a change in the atmosphere. The organization's monitors flickered with an unexplainable signal, a variable they had not accounted for in their equations. The era of Ash Ketchum was beginning, not with a roar of power, but with the simple, determined footsteps of a boy and a spark of electricity that refused to be contained. The dawn had finally arrived, and the long, turbulent evening of the region was giving way to the bright, unpredictable light of a new day. The morning sun climbed higher over Pallet Town, burning away the last of the coastal mist. In the wake of the boys' frantic arrival at the laboratory, the air seemed to hum with a newfound electricity. The laboratory, usually a place of quiet study, was now the site of a profound beginning. The chronicler, known to the world as Professor Oak, looked upon the young traveler not with the stern gaze of an academic, but with the patient eyes of one who understood the weight of destiny. The room was filled with the soft whirring of machines and the scent of old paper, but all focus was on the small, wooden table where the journey's first tools lay waiting. The boy had arrived late, finding the traditional choices already claimed, yet the land had a way of providing exactly what was needed for the trials ahead. From the depths of the laboratory's inner sanctum, a unique vessel was brought forth. It contained a spirit that refused to be bound by the conventional rules of the modern age. A creature of bright yellow fur and eyes that sparkled with a fierce, independent spark. This was not a companion that would simply follow. It was a partner that would challenge. When the boy first reached out, he was met not with a warm embrace, but with a sharp, crackling discharge of energy. This initial shock was a physical reminder that the bond between human and Pokémon was not something to be taken for granted. It had to be earned through patience, respect, and shared experience. As the boy and the lightning dweller stepped out of the laboratory and onto the dirt path of Route 1, the world seemed to hold its breath. The journey began not with a grand parade, but with the steady crunch of gravel under boots and the rustle of wind through the tall grass. The boy and his rebellious companion moved away from the safety of the village, heading toward the emerald depths of the northern woods. To the boy, the path was a playground of possibility. To the watchful eyes of the regional guardians, it was the start of a reclamation. The organization's influence still lingered in the shadows of the nearby cities, their mechanical sensors picking up the faint, erratic signature of the boy's companion. They saw him as an anomaly, a variable that did not fit their models of control. They did not yet realize that this small, unpolished light was the first flame of a fire that would eventually consume their shadows. As they reached the outskirts of the forest, the atmosphere shifted. The sunlight was filtered through the dense canopy of Viridian, creating a world of dappled light and deep shadows. Here, the boy faced his first true test of the spirit. A sudden storm, born from the agitated currents of the legendary guardians, broke over the trees with a violence that shook the earth. In the midst of the rain and the thunder, a flock of winged hunters descended, driven to aggression by the region's unrest. The boy did not flee. Instead, he stood as a shield for his injured companion, offering his own safety to protect the flickering spark of the yellow spirit. In that moment of selfless sacrifice, the barrier between them shattered. The bolt of lightning that followed was not an attack on the boy, but a roar of defiance against the darkness, a signal to the entire region that the original bond had been restored. High above the storm, a shimmer of gold appeared in the sky, a bird of mythic proportions that had not been seen by human eyes in centuries. It was an omen of the new era, its wings trailing a rainbow that defied the gray clouds. It watched the boy and the Pikachu for a fleeting second before vanishing into the horizon, heading toward the distant peaks of the north. This sighting was a gift from the land itself, a confirmation that the path they had chosen was aligned with the ancient heartbeat of Kanto. The boy watched the disappearing light with wide eyes, his heart swelling with a purpose he couldn't yet name. The journey was no longer just about reaching the next town. It was about the elevation of the spirit in a world that had forgotten how to dream. The night fell over their first campfire with a peaceful weight. The boy sat by the flames, his companion resting nearby, no longer separated by a sphere of containment, but linked by a shared memory of the storm. The psychic entity in the northern cave felt the resonance of their victory, its own troubled mind finding a brief moment of stillness in their harmony. The organization in Saffron recorded the event as a localized surge of energy, unaware that the foundation of their power had just been irrevocably cracked. The world of Kanto was waking up, 1 mile at a time, led by a boy who didn't want to rule the world, but simply wanted to see everything it had to show him. Entering the gates of Viridian City, the boy and his companion felt the immediate shift from the wild, restorative air of the forest to the structured, watchful atmosphere of urban life. Viridian was a place of heavy stone and ancient secrets, its architecture reflecting the sturdy resilience of the nearby mountains. However, a shroud of unease hung over the streets. The local Guardian's Hall stood silent and shuttered, its doors locked by a power that even the townspeople did not fully understand. The organization's presence here was subtle but absolute. Their agents moved through the shadows of the alleyways, monitoring the flow of travelers with a cold, mechanical detachment. The boy, carrying his injured partner toward the glow of the healing sanctuary, was unaware that he was walking through a fortress of the very shadows he would eventually have to disperse. Inside the sanctuary, the boy encountered the true heart of the region's endurance. The healers here were the keepers of the light, their lives dedicated to the restoration of the spirit. They moved with a rhythmic grace, their hands guided by a deep-seated empathy that the machines of Saffron could never replicate. As the golden spark of his companion was nursed back to strength, the boy saw the scars that the recent era of discord had left on the land's inhabitants. He met other wanderers who spoke of the growing corruption in the north and the strange artificial tremors felt in the south. This was his first glimpse into the larger struggle of Kanto, a realization that his journey was part of a much broader tapestry of resistance. The sanctuary was a neutral ground, a place where the logic of the collective could not penetrate, and where the original bond was still treated as a miracle. That night, the peace of the sanctuary was shattered by an incursion of the organization's most persistent agents. They did not come with the subtlety of the shadows, but with the roar of engines and the cold light of industrial tools. They sought to seize the spirits resting within the facility, viewing the sanctuary's bounty as nothing more than fuel for their expansion. It was here that the boy faced his first direct confrontation with the ideology of control. Standing amidst the flickering lights and the smell of ozone, he and his partner stood their ground. The battle was not fought with the polished strategy of a master, but with the raw, unpredictable power of a bond newly forged in the storm. The surge of electricity that cleared the hall was a physical rejection of the organization's greed, forcing the intruders back into the night. As they left the city at dawn, heading toward the gray peaks of the north, the boy felt the weight of his role beginning to settle. He was no longer just a child of Pallet. He was a carrier of the flame. The path toward the first regional guardian in Pewter City lay through the high passes where the air was thin and the stone was unforgiving. This journey was a descent into the history of the earth itself, a trek through the canyons where the fossils of the ancients lay buried in the strata. The boy's companion moved with a new confidence, its ears twitching at the sounds of the mountains, its spirit synchronized with the boy's determination. They were a singular unit now, a defiance of the isolation that the laboratory on Cinnabar had tried to manufacture. In the shadows of the Pewter Mountains, the guardian of the stone waited. He was a man of few words, his spirit as unyielding as the granite he commanded. He had watched the rise of the industrial era with a quiet disdain, holding his ground against the organization's pressure to modernize his traditions. He sought a traveler who possessed the endurance of the rock and the purity of the mountain spring. When the boy finally arrived at the gates of the stone hall, the air was cool and filled with the scent of crushed minerals. The trial that awaited them was not just a test of strength, but a test of will. A challenge to see if the spark of the southern valleys could survive the crushing weight of the northern heights. The first true milestone of the journey had been reached, and the story of Kanto was about to witness the collision of the old earth and the new light. The psychic entity in its distant cavern felt this arrival as a steadying pulse in the region's energy. It watched the boy's progress with an analytical intensity, recognizing the echoes of the mythic ancestor in the way the boy moved through the world. The organization, regrouping in the heart of Saffron, marked the boy as a priority target, their data streams filling with reports of his interference. The pieces of the great alignment were moving faster now, drawn together by the gravity of the boy's innocence. As the boy stepped into the dim light of the pewter hall, the silence of the mountains seemed to deepen, waiting for the first strike of the trial that would echo through the history of the land. In the dim, cavernous hall of Pewter City, the air was still and heavy with the scent of ancient dust and cold stone. The guardian, Brock, stood like a statue at the far end of the arena, his presence a reflection of the unyielding mountains that cradled his home. To him, the world was built on a foundation of resilience. He saw the flashy innovations of the southern cities as fleeting, whereas the rock was eternal. When the boy and his companions stepped onto the field, they were met with the overwhelming weight of this philosophy. The trial began not with a flurry of movement, but with a slow, grinding force. The Guardian's companions were titans of gray stone and hardened earth, beings that had survived the shifting of tectonic plates. Against them, the boy's spark seemed small and fragile, a flickering candle against a landslide. The battle was a grueling lesson in the nature of persistence. Every strike from the lightning dweller seemed to dissipate against the dense mineral armor of the stone giants. The boy felt the frustration rising, a reflection of the psychic tension that had gripped the region for years. But in the heat of the struggle, he remembered the lessons of the Viridian storm. The bond was not about overcoming nature, but moving with it. He began to look past the surface of the stone, finding the hidden fissures and the points of balance. He directed his partner with a new, quiet precision, using the environment to their advantage. When the final clash occurred, it was not a victory of raw power, but of adaptability. The Guardian watched as his massive stone towers were outmaneuvered by the agile light, and for the first time in years, a smile touched his lips. He saw in the boy the same endurance that defined the mountains, but tempered with the fluidity of a new age. With the first mark of the regional guardians in hand, the boy and his partner moved toward the east, where the geography of Kanto plummeted into the depths of Mt. Moon. This was a place where the barrier between the earth and the heavens was uniquely thin. The tunnels were illuminated by the soft, pulsing glow of celestial stones, minerals that had fallen from the stars during the world's infancy. In these lightless halls, the boy encountered the organization once more. They were here to strip the mountain of its treasures, seeking to harness the lunar energy to fuel their psychic experiments. The air was thick with the sound of drilling and the harsh, artificial lights of their machinery, a violent intrusion upon the silence of the ancient tunnels. The struggle within the mountain was a fight for the sanctity of the region's heritage. The boy found himself allied with the shy, star-dwelling creatures that had called these caves home since the dawn of time. These beings, with their large eyes and gentle spirits, were the keepers of the mountain's secrets. Together, they navigated the labyrinthine paths, using the natural echoes of the cave to mislead the organization's agents. The final confrontation took place in a central chamber where a massive, glowing moonstone sat as a silent witness to the ages. The victory was a quiet one. The organization was forced back into the sunlit world, leaving the mountain to its peaceful, starlit slumber. The boy emerged from the eastern exit with a deeper understanding of the world's interconnectedness, carrying the scent of the stars on his clothes. Descending from the heights, the path opened into the lush, water-rich plains of Cerulean City. Here, the air was filled with the mist of waterfalls and the constant, rhythmic sound of flowing streams. The city was a masterpiece of aquatic design, its canals reflecting the azure sky, and its people moving with a grace that mirrored the currents. The second guardian, Misty, was the mistress of the waters, a fierce protector of the region's purity. She saw the boy's arrival as a challenge to her element's fluid strength. To her, the water was a mirror. It reflected the true heart of anyone who dared to traverse it. The trial in Cerulean would be a test of clarity and flow, a question of whether the boy's spark could find its way through the depths without being extinguished by the tide. As the sun set over the Cerulean bridges, the organization's presence was felt as a cold ripple in the water. They were lurking in the nearby groves, watching the boy's every move. The psychic entity in the north felt the boy's proximity, its mind reaching out to sense the growing strength of the bond. The journey was accelerating. The initial innocence of the boy's departure now forged into a determined resolve. Every step through the Kanto valleys was a stitch in the healing of the land, a reclamation of the harmony that the shadows had tried to steal. The boy and his companions stood by the water's edge, looking toward the horizon, ready for the trials that lay beneath the surface. The boy stood on the edge of the Cerulean Cape, where the fresh river water met the salt of the sea. The air here was heavy with the fragrance of blooming sea lilies and the distant, rhythmic crash of waves against the cliffs. This was a land of constant movement and clarity. The second guardian, Misty, led the boy to a theater of water, a massive, shimmering pool that seemed to hold the depth of the ocean itself. In this trial, there was no solid ground to rely on. The boy's companion, the spark of the southern valleys, watched the rippling surface with a wary eye. Water was the perfect conductor for their power, but it was also a fathomless weight that could swallow a small flame in an instant. The trial was a dance of fluidity. The Guardian's companions moved through the depths like silver streaks, their strikes coming from angles the boy could barely track. He realized that against the water, he could not use the same rigid determination he had employed against the stone of the north. He had to learn to flow. He began to time his partner's energy with the crest of the waves, turning the Guardian's own element into a bridge for the lightning. When the final surge of electricity hit the water, it didn't just strike. It illuminated the entire hall in a brilliant, sapphire glow. The Guardian stepped forward, the water dripping from her hair like diamonds, and acknowledged the boy's growth. He had shown that his spirit was not just persistent, but clear, as deep and unyielding as the sea itself. Leaving the azure beauty of Cerulean, the boy traveled south toward the port of Vermilion. The path took him through the golden fields of the Central Plains, where the sun seemed to linger longer than anywhere else. However, as the salty breeze of the coast grew stronger, so did the signs of the organization's industrial grip. Vermilion was a city of iron and steam. The massive docks were crowded with tankers and cargo ships, many of them flying the dark banners of the collective. The sound of heavy machinery drowned out the cries of the gulls, and the air carried the sharp, metallic tang of burning fuel. Here, the organization was no longer hiding in the shadows. They were the architects of the city's commerce, turning the gateway to the world into a hub for their global reach. In the center of this industrial maze stood the hall of the third guardian, Lieutenant Surge. He was a man forged in the fires of conflict, a veteran who viewed the world through the lens of tactical precision and overwhelming force. His arena was a forest of copper wires and humming transformers, a place where the air itself was constantly ionized. To him, the boy's bond was a primitive relic. He believed in the total mastery of energy, using machines to amplify the power of his companions until they were living batteries of raw, destructive force. The trial in Vermilion was a clash of philosophies. The natural, chaotic spark of the heart versus the regulated, artificial lightning of the machine. The battle was an assault on the senses. The thunder in the room was so loud it felt like a physical blow, and the flashes of light were blinding. The boy's companion was pushed to its absolute limit, facing a version of itself that had been hardened and accelerated by the Guardian's relentless training. For a moment, it seemed the artificial power would prevail, but the machine lacked the one thing the boy possessed: the ability to feel. He reached out to his partner, not with a command, but with a memory of the Pallet Hills and the Viridian Rain. That connection provided a surge of energy that no transformer could match, a resonance that bypassed the Guardian's defenses and short-circuited the very machines meant to contain it. The Guardian stood in the sudden silence of his darkened hall, humbled by the realization that the strongest current was the one that flowed between two spirits. As the boy walked out onto the Vermilion docks, he saw a massive luxury vessel, the Saint, and preparing to depart. It was a floating palace for the region's elite, but beneath its gilded surface, the organization was hosting a secret gathering of its highest-ranking agents. The psychic entity in the north felt the concentration of dark ambition on the water and stirred in its sleep. The boy looked at the ship, then at the horizon where the sun was setting into the sea. He knew that his journey was no longer a solitary path of self-discovery. He was becoming the pivot point upon which the fate of Kanto turned. The shadows were gathering for a final play, and the boy, with 3 marks of the Guardians now shining in his pack, prepared to step into the heart of the storm. The golden light of the setting sun glinted off the polished hull of the SS and as it groaned against its moorings in Vermilion Harbor. To the boy, the ship was a magnificent titan of a bygone era, a relic of luxury that seemed out of place in a world increasingly defined by the organization's cold efficiency. As he stepped across the gangplank, the heavy scent of sea salt was replaced by the aroma of exotic spices and expensive perfumes. The grand ballrooms were filled with the laughter of the region's elite, oblivious to the fact that beneath the velvet carpets and crystal chandeliers, the ship was a hive of clandestine activity. The organization had transformed the lower decks into a mobile command center, using the ship's voyage as a cover to move rare artifacts and sensitive data away from the prying eyes of the regional guardians. Moving through the narrow, brass-fitted corridors, the boy felt a growing sense of unease. His companion, the spark of the southern valleys, bristled at every passing shadow, its ears twitching at the low-frequency hum of hidden machinery. They encountered other travelers, some seeking fortune, others seeking glory, but the air was thick with a competitive tension. In the bowels of the ship, the boy faced his most direct confrontation with the organization's foot soldiers. These were not the desperate agents he had seen in the forests, but a disciplined unit trained to view their partners as nothing more than weapons in an arsenal. The skirmishes in the tight hallways were frantic and claustrophobic, a test of quick reflexes and unwavering trust. Each victory for the boy was a small tear in the veil of the organization's secrecy. At the heart of the vessel, the boy met a rival whose journey mirrored his own, yet was fueled by a different fire. This was a wanderer who valued strength above connection, believing that the path to the high plateau was a race to be won at any cost. Their battle on the windswept deck was a clash of speed and raw power, the spray of the ocean stinging their eyes as the ship cut through the waves. The boy realized that the shadows he fought were not just found in the organization, but in the temptation to prioritize victory over the well-being of his companion. He chose to fight with a defensive grace, absorbing the rival's aggression until the moment was right to strike with a focused, illuminating light. The rival retreated, leaving the boy alone with the sound of the churning sea and the realization that the greatest battles were often fought within. As the ship prepared to leave the harbor, the boy was summoned to the captain's quarters. The captain was a man who had spent his life on the waves, his face etched with the lines of 1,000 storms. He saw in the boy a reflection of the ancient voyagers who had first mapped the Kanto shores. He revealed that the organization was tracking a peculiar energy signature, one that matched the psychic entity in the northern cave. They believed the key to controlling the region lay in a hidden technique that could cut through the densest thickets and the strongest barriers. He passed this knowledge to the boy, a gift of ancient wisdom that the machines of the collective could never grasp. This was the cut, a rhythmic harmony of movement that allowed a wanderer to clear the path ahead without destroying the life that inhabited it. With the ship's whistle echoing across the bay, the boy leapt back onto the stone docks just as the vessel began its long journey toward the horizon. He stood in the fading light, the mark of the industrial guardian shining in his pack and the new wisdom of the sea etched in his mind. The organization's hold on the harbor was momentarily broken, their secret meeting disrupted and their data scattered. But the boy knew that Vermilion was only a gateway. To the north lay the deep, shadowed woods of the central plateau and the lavender-scented mists of the town of memories. The psychic entity stirred once more, sensing that the traveler was moving closer to the heart of the region's unresolved grief. The night air in Vermilion grew still as the SS and vanished into the dark blue of the ocean. The boy and his partner turned their gaze back toward the land, toward the winding path that led through the rocky tunnels and into the emerald silence of the inland forests. They were no longer just survivors of the storm. They were the architects of a new balance. The journey was moving into a phase of deep reflection and hidden truths, where the ghosts of the past would demand an audience with the light of the present. The road was long, but for the first time, the boy felt the heartbeat of the land guiding his every step. Leaving the industrial iron of Vermilion behind, the boy and his companion turned their gaze toward the northeast, where the air began to lose its salty sting and took on the cool, damp scent of ancient earth. The path led through a narrow mountain pass, a place where the sun struggled to reach the valley floor even at midday. This was the entrance to the rock tunnel, a lightless labyrinth that served as the natural gate to the eastern plains. In the darkness of the cave, the boy relied entirely on the glow of his partner's electricity and the new rhythmic cut he had mastered to clear the overgrown roots blocking the way. The tunnel was a place of sensory deprivation, where the only sounds were the dripping of water and the distant, heavy breathing of the stone dwellers. It was a journey into the subconscious of the land, forcing the traveler to trust his instincts over his sight. Emerging from the darkness of the tunnel, the boy found himself on the outskirts of Lavender Town. The atmosphere here was unlike any other place in Kanto. A perpetual, low-hanging mist clung to the ground, smelling faintly of incense and dried wildflowers. The town was anchored by the towering silhouette of the Pokémon Tower, a 7-story monument of gray stone that served as the final resting place for the spirits of the region. There were no bustling markets or clanging machines here. The silence was deep and respectful, broken only by the mournful tolling of the tower's bells. The people of Lavender moved with a quiet solemnity, their lives dedicated to the preservation of memory. It was a town of transition, where the living came to honor the bonds that had been severed by time. As the boy approached the base of the tower, he felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The organization had been seen lurking in the upper reaches of the monument, their mechanical equipment a jarring violation of the sacred space. They were searching for the spirits of the departed, hoping to harness the spectral energy to enhance their psychic research on Cinnabar. This intrusion had left the spirits of the tower in a state of profound agitation. A restless, unidentifiable presence, a massive, swirling ghost, blocked the path to the higher floors, its wails echoing through the stone corridors. The boy realized that his power, so effective against stone and water, was useless against a grief that had no physical form. He needed a way to see into the heart of the mist, to identify the source of the sorrow before he could hope to soothe it. He journeyed briefly toward the west, seeking a device that could bridge the gap between the seen and the unseen. In the busy streets of Celadon City, he encountered the hidden headquarters of the organization, a sprawling subterranean complex hidden beneath a simple hall of games. This was the belly of the beast, a place of neon lights, whirring computers, and cold, calculating greed. The contrast between the spiritual silence of Lavender and the hollow noise of the Celadon underground was jarring. The boy navigated the maze of rotating floors and hidden traps, facing the organization's leaders in their own sanctuary. It was here that he recovered the Sylph Scope, a masterpiece of optical engineering that could reveal the true nature of the spirits. This victory was a turning point. It proved that the technology of the modern world could be used to honor the past rather than exploit it. Returning to the Pokémon Tower with the scope in hand, the boy ascended the spiral stairs once more. As he reached the top floor, he raised the device and saw the truth. The restless spirit was not a monster, but the soul of a mother who had perished protecting her child from the organization's agents. Her grief had bound her to the tower, her pain amplified by the presence of the intruders. The boy did not attack. Instead, he stood in silent witness to her story, allowing his own empathy to act as a bridge. Under the gaze of the scope, the spirit finally found the peace she had been seeking. Her form softened into a gentle light, and she ascended into the mist, leaving a sense of profound calm in her wake. The organization's agents, unable to stand the purity of the moment, fled back into the shadows of the central plains. The psychic entity in the northern cave felt this resolution as a wave of warmth in a cold sea. It recognized that the boy was not just a warrior, but a healer of the region's deepest wounds. The town of Lavender began to breathe again, the bells ringing with a clearer, more hopeful tone. The boy stood at the top of the tower, looking out over the misty plains toward the emerald lights of Celadon. He had faced the shadows of death and the greed of the collective, and he had emerged with his heart intact. The journey was moving toward its center, toward the city of Saffron, where the ultimate struggle for the region's mind would soon take place. Leaving the misty echoes of Lavender behind, the boy and his partner traveled west toward the emerald heart of Kanto, Celadon City. This was a place of unparalleled beauty, a sprawling sanctuary where the architecture was woven seamlessly into the flora. The air was thick and sweet with the scent of 1,000 blooming lilies, and the streets were lined with vibrant hedges and ancient, weeping willows. Celadon was a city of life and healing, a stark contrast to the iron-gray docks of Vermilion or the stone halls of Pewter. However, even here, the organization's shadow was felt. Their influence had seeped into the city's hidden corners, their secret headquarters churning beneath the surface like a dark root in a healthy garden. The city's beauty served as a veil, hiding the tension between the peace-loving citizens and the cold ambitions of the collective. The fourth guardian, Erica, was the mistress of the gardens, a woman whose spirit was as delicate and resilient as the rare blossoms she tended. Her hall was a massive greenhouse, a glass-domed cathedral of green where the light was soft and the humidity felt like a warm embrace. To her, the boy's journey was a cycle of growth. She viewed the bond between human and Pokémon as a delicate ecosystem that required constant nurturing and balance. The trial in Celadon was not a display of raw power, but a test of fragrance and slow, deliberate movement. Her companions were beings of vines and petals, capable of lulling an opponent to sleep with a single breath of pollen or binding them in a tangle of unbreakable roots. The boy's spark was a fire that had to be contained. He had to prove he could move through the garden without burning it down. The battle was a slow, hypnotic struggle. The air in the greenhouse was heavy with sleeping spores, making every movement feel like wading through deep water. The boy realized that the aggressive speed he had used in the past would only lead to exhaustion. He instructed his partner to stay low and move with the rhythm of the swaying vines, using small bursts of energy to clear the path. It was a lesson in patience, waiting for the brief moment when the flower opens to the sun. When the final strike landed, it was precise and controlled, like a single beam of light piercing through a dense canopy. Erica smiled, recognizing that the boy had mastered the Mega Drain, the ability to draw strength from the earth and the environment to sustain his own spirit. He received the Rainbow Mark, a symbol of the diversity and vitality he had defended. However, the peace of the garden was a temporary reprieve. To truly free Celadon, the boy had to confront the darkness beneath the game corner. Descending once more into the subterranean maze, he reached the inner sanctum of the organization's leader. This was a man of cold, calculating shadow, who looked upon the boy with an indifference that was more chilling than anger. Their encounter was a clash of worldviews. The boy's belief in the individual bond versus the leader's vision of a world ruled by strength and commerce. Though the leader retreated into the shadows of Saffron, he left behind the Sylph Scope and a trail of evidence that pointed toward the ultimate transgression occurring in the heart of the region. The boy emerged from the underground into the golden afternoon of Celadon, knowing that the time for small skirmishes was over. With the Emerald Mark in his possession, the boy looked toward the south and the west. The path was now leading him toward the Great Marsh and the cycling roads that connected the Central Plains to the coast. The air was changing again, becoming warmer and more humid as he approached the domain of the poisons and the masters of the safari. The psychic entity in the north felt the leader's retreat and the boy's advance, its own internal walls beginning to crumble under the weight of the boy's persistent light. The organization was consolidating its power in Saffron, preparing for a final stand that would determine the fate of the Sylph Collective and the region's psychic future. As the boy left the floral gates of Celadon, he carried with him the scent of the gardens and the resilience of the roots. He was no longer just following a path, he was carving one. The middle of his journey was behind him, and the great trials of the masters were looming on the horizon. The sun set behind the western mountains, casting long, purple shadows across the plains, but the boy walked with a steady stride, his partner's cheeks flickering with a quiet, confident spark. Leaving the emerald tranquility of Celadon, the boy and his partner journeyed south toward the warm, humid breath of the great marsh. The path took them down the long, winding cycling road, where the wind rushed past like a living thing, and finally into the quiet, vine-choked outskirts of Fuchsia City. This was a place of deep shadows and ancient instincts, a town that served as the gateway to the Safari Zone, a vast wilderness where the Pokémon lived according to the primal laws of the earth. The air here was heavy with the scent of damp moss and exotic musk. Fuchsia was the domain of the unseen, a city that celebrated the art of the ninja and the subtle, creeping power of the toxins that protected the natural world from intrusion. The fifth guardian, Koga, was a master of misdirection and shadow. His hall was a labyrinth of invisible walls and hidden traps, designed to confuse the senses and test the traveler's awareness. To him, the world was a series of decoys. True strength lay in the move you didn't see coming. His companions were beings of smoke and venom, capable of vanishing into the rafters or striking with a precision that left an opponent weakened before the battle even truly began. The trial in Fuchsia was a test of perception. The boy's spark was a beacon that could easily become a target in the dim light. He had to learn to trust his ears and his intuition, moving through the hall not as a conqueror, but as a silent part of the environment itself. The battle was a masterclass in attrition. The air was thick with poisonous smog, making every breath a struggle. The boy realized that he couldn't simply overpower the shadows. He used his partner's electricity to illuminate the invisible barriers, turning the Guardian's own traps into markers for movement. He practiced the surf technique he had glimpsed in the southern waters, allowing his energy to flow around the obstacles rather than crashing into them. When the final strike was delivered, it came from a position the Guardian hadn't anticipated. A strike born from the boy's ability to remain calm in the center of the confusion. Koga stepped from the shadows, offering the soul mark, acknowledging that the boy had mastered the art of seeing through the veil of the world. Beyond the gymnasium, the boy explored the deep reaches of the Safari Zone. Here, he encountered the secret house and recovered the golden teeth of the warden, an act of kindness that restored the voice of the town's oldest protector. In return, he was granted the strength to move the very boulders of the earth, a physical manifestation of his growing internal resolve. This power allowed him to navigate the Seafoam Islands to the south, a frozen subterranean world of ice and current. In the heart of these islands, he felt the presence of the first legendary bird, Articuno. The air was so cold it felt like glass, and the silence was absolute. The boy did not seek to capture the spirit, but to witness it, receiving a silent blessing of frost that tempered his inner fire with the clarity of the north. However, the peace of the wilderness was overshadowed by the news from the north. The organization had finally launched its full-scale occupation of Saffron City. The Sylph Towers were being used to transmit a signal that would amplify the collective psychic control over the entire region. The people of Saffron were trapped behind a wall of energy, and the regional guardians were calling for a final convergence of the resistance. The boy looked toward the towering skyline of the central plateau, knowing that the time for wandering was over. He had the strength to move the earth and the soul to see through the shadows. Now, he needed the courage to face the heart of the machine. As he left the tropical warmth of Fuchsia, heading back toward the center of the map, the psychic entity in its cavern roared in its sleep. Felt the boy's approach like a rising tide. The organization's monitors in Saffron were blinking red, their leaders realizing that the anomaly from Pallet was no longer a minor interference, but a threat to their entire vision. The boy and his partner walked with a rhythmic, heavy stride, the ground beneath them vibrating with the weight of the coming confrontation. The final pieces were falling into place for the liberation of Saffron. The boy stood before the massive, steel-rimmed gates of Saffron City, where the air hummed with a low-frequency psychic vibration. This was the crown jewel of Kanto, a metropolis of soaring glass and gold. But today it was a silent prison. The organization's shadow had fully lengthened. Every street corner was occupied by agents in dark uniforms, and a shimmering violet barrier pulsed around the Sylph Company headquarters, the tower of innovation that had become the brain of the collective's control. The boy's companion, the spark of the southern valleys, stood with its fur bristling, sensing the unnatural distortion of the air. This was no longer a journey of discovery. It was a mission of liberation. Breaking through the perimeter, the boy entered the labyrinth of the Sylph Company tower. Inside, the world was a dizzying array of teleportation pads and sliding steel doors. The organization had turned the sanctuary of progress into a fortress of confusion, using the very technology meant to connect people to isolate them instead. As the boy ascended the 11 floors, he faced the elite enforcers of the collective. These were not mere guards. They were the architects of the new order, using psychic force to bend the reality of the hallways. The boy relied on the Sylph scope to see through their illusions and the strength of his spirit to push through the mental fatigue. Each floor was a battle for the mind of the region, a slow reclamation of the city's stolen future. On the upper decks, the boy encountered the rival once more. The tension between them was palpable, but the weight of the occupation had shifted the stakes. Their battle amidst the humming server banks was the final shedding of their old antagonism. Through the clash of their powers, they realized that the organization was the true enemy of both their paths. In a rare moment of unspoken alliance, the rival cleared the way, allowing the boy to reach the inner sanctum where the president of the Sylph Collective was being held. This was the heart of the machine, a room filled with monitors projecting the cold ambitions of the organization's leader, Giovanni. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, oppressive weight of the leader's personal guard. The confrontation with the leader was a collision of destinies. Giovanni looked upon the boy not as a hero, but as a glitch in his perfect equation. He fought with the crushing weight of the earth, using beings of tectonic power to try and extinguish the boy's light. But the boy had been forged in the storms of the north and the currents of the south. He used the fluidity of the water and the clarity of the soul to dismantle the leader's strategy piece by piece. When the final blow fell, it wasn't just a victory of power, but a rejection of the leader's philosophy. The psychic barrier around the city shattered, the violet light dispersing like mist in the sun. Giovanni retreated into the shadows of the west, leaving behind the Master Ball, the ultimate vessel of containment, which the boy vowed would never be used to enslave a spirit. With Saffron liberated, the city breathed again. The seventh guardian, Sabrina, stepped forward from her hall of mirrors. She was a woman of profound psychic talent who had seen the boy's arrival in her visions years ago. To her, the boy was the variable of the heart, the one element the machines could never predict. Their trial was a silent, mental struggle, a battle fought in the quiet spaces between thoughts. She tested the boy's ability to remain centered amidst a whirlwind of telekinetic force. By passing her trial, he received the Marsh Mark, proving that his spirit was now attuned to the deepest vibrations of the world. He had mastered the mind, just as he had mastered the stone, the water, and the plant. As the boy left the golden gates of Saffron, the sun was setting, casting a long, protective shadow over the freed city. He had 7 marks in his pack. Only one remained. To the west lay the volcanic ruins of Cinnabar, the place where the artificial tragedy had begun, and where the final guardian waited in the heat of the magma. The psychic entity in its northern cave felt the liberation of Saffron as a surge of hope, its own internal darkness beginning to fade into a reflective calm. The boy turned his gaze toward the sea, ready to return to the island of his birth's shadow to complete the circle of the land. Leaving the iron towers of Saffron behind, the boy and his partner returned to the edge of the southern sea, where the air grew heavy with the scent of sulfur and parched earth. To reach the volcanic remains of Cinnabar Island, they navigated the churning currents of the southern channels, a journey that required a deep harmony with the ocean's erratic pulse. As the silhouette of the island emerged through the heat haze, it looked like a jagged, blackened tooth rising from the deep. This was the place where the region's greatest tragedy had been forged in a laboratory of glass and cold ambition. The ruins of that facility still clung to the cliffs, a skeletal reminder of the hubris that had birthed the psychic entity now hidden in the north. The eighth guardian, Blaine, was a man who lived in the shadow of the volcano, his spirit tempered by the absolute heat of the Earth's core. His hall was not a traditional building, but a series of chambers carved directly into the volcanic rock, illuminated by the orange glow of flowing magma. To him, the world was a crucible. Only that which was pure could survive the flame. He was a master of riddles and intense heat, testing the traveler's ability to think under pressure. His companions were beings of living fire, capable of turning the air into a shimmering wall of heat that threatened to quench the boy's spark. The trial on Cinnabar was a test of endurance and thermal clarity, a question of whether the boy's light could burn brighter than the furnace of the earth. The battle was a fierce, searing confrontation. The ground beneath their feet was hot to the touch, and the air shimmered with the intensity of the Guardian's power. The boy realized that he couldn't fight fire with aggression. He had to use the fire spin of his opponent's logic against them. He instructed his partner to move with the rising heat, using the updrafts to gain a speed that made them a blur of yellow light against the red backdrop. When the final strike was delivered, it was a precise discharge that bypassed the flames and struck the center of the Guardian's defense. Blaine laughed, his eyes bright with the reflection of the magma, and handed the boy the volcano mark. He recognized that the boy had passed through the fire and emerged not as ash, but as hardened steel. While on the island, the boy returned to the ruins of the burnt laboratory. In the silence of the charred corridors, he found the final journals of the scientists who had sought to clone the mythic ancestor. The pages spoke of a creature that was too powerful to contain, and filled with a sorrow that mirrored the world. This was the moment of total realization for the boy. He understood that the psychic entity was not a monster to be feared, but a soul seeking a place in a world that had rejected its birth. The secret key he found within the ruins was not just a tool for the gymnasium, but a metaphor for the empathy needed to unlock the entity's isolation. The cycle of Cinnabar was complete, and the boy felt a profound sense of responsibility for the being that shared his regional heritage. With the eighth mark secured, the boy's pack now held the full spectrum of Kanto's elemental authority. He had the stone of the north, the water of the coast, the lightning of the port, the grass of the gardens, the soul of the mists, the mind of the city, and the fire of the island. The path was now leading back to where it all began, the silent, shuttered hall of Viridian City. The final guardian, the mysterious master of the eighth hall, had returned to his seat of power. The air in Viridian was now thick with a familiar, dark energy, a signal that the leader of the organization, Giovanni, had retreated to his final stronghold to face the traveler one last time. The psychic entity in its northern cave stood up, its violet eyes glowing with a sudden, clear intensity. It felt the boy's completion of the trials as a call to witness the final resolution. The legendary birds circled the Indigo Plateau, their cries echoing across the mountains like a herald of the coming dawn. The boy boarded a small craft and sailed back toward the mainland, his partner resting its head against his knee. They were moving toward the final intersection of their journey, where the strength of the heart would be tested against the ultimate master of the earth. The journey came full circle as the boy returned to the gates of Viridian City. The silent, shuttered hall that had remained locked since the beginning of his travels was now wide open, its stone pillars vibrating with a familiar, heavy resonance. This was the final threshold. Inside, the eighth guardian stood in the shadows, revealed at last as Giovanni, the leader of the collective that had sought to commodify the region's soul. He had retreated from Saffron to his original seat of power, intending to prove that the raw, crushing strength of the earth was superior to the flickering spark of a boy's ambition. The arena was a place of shifting sands and jagged granite, a literal foundation of the world where there was no room for error. The final trial was an earthquake of the spirit. Giovanni fought with the relentless pressure of a mountain, his companions striking with a force that cracked the very floor of the gymnasium. Every move was calculated to bury the boy's light under a landslide of power. But the boy was no longer the frantic child who had run late from Pallet Town. He carried the wisdom of the waterfalls, the resilience of the volcanic flame, and the clarity of the psychic halls. He moved with a calm that unsettled the leader, his partner's electricity finding the small, vital gaps in the shifting earth. The battle was a symphony of elements, a final rejection of the idea that life could be mastered by force. When the dust settled, the leader's tectonic power was spent, and the Earth Mark, the final key to the plateau, was earned. With all 8 marks shining in his pack, the boy stood at the entrance to the Victory Road, a grueling mountain pass that served as the final filter for those seeking the highest honor. This was a place where the air was thin and the stone was ancient, a labyrinth designed to test every ounce of a traveler's endurance. The organization's influence was gone, replaced by the pure, unyielding challenge of the land itself. The boy navigated the boulders and the rushing subterranean rivers, his spirit and his partner's spark moving in a perfect, wordless rhythm. They were no longer 2 separate beings. They were a singular force of nature, a living testament to the harmony that Kanto had been yearning for since the dawn of the industrial era. As he emerged from the dark tunnels of the pass, the horizon opened up to reveal the Indigo Plateau. The great stadium rose from the mountain peaks like a crown, illuminated by the golden light of a setting sun that seemed to touch the edge of the world. Here, the 4 highest authorities of the region, the masters of the ice, the stone, the ghost, and the dragon, stood in silent vigil. They were the ultimate keepers of the balance, and to challenge them was to challenge the very history of Kanto. The boy looked up at the towering spires, his heart steady and his mind clear. He knew that the psychic entity in the northern cave was watching, and that the legendary birds were circling high above, waiting for the resolution of this cycle. The first of the 4 was Lorelei, the mistress of the frozen currents. Her hall was a world of shimmering frost and biting winds, where the water's flow was arrested by the absolute stillness of the ice. To her, the battle was a test of grace and preservation. The boy had to prove that his fire was not a destructive force, but a warmth that could survive the coldest winter. Their clash was a dance of ice and light, a beautiful and terrifying display of elemental power. By overcoming the frost, the boy proved that his spirit was unquenchable. He moved deeper into the plateau, the temperature rising as he approached the Hall of Bruno, the master of the unyielding stone and the strength of the physical form. The journey was reaching its zenith. The boy was no longer just a wanderer. He was the champion of the living heart. The halls of the plateau were a gauntlet of the soul, each victory bringing him closer to the final confrontation with his rival and the ultimate truth of the region's destiny. The air was thin, the stakes were absolute, and the spark of the southern valleys burned brighter than it ever had before. The world held its breath as the boy stepped into the second hall, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the history of the land. In the thin, crystalline air of the Indigo Plateau, the boy moved from the halls of ice into the domain of the unyielding mountain. The second of the 4 masters, Bruno, stood in an arena of rugged stone and heavy iron. To him, the world was defined by the discipline of the physical form and the raw endurance of the earth. His presence was like a granite wall, demanding a strength that went beyond mere strategy. The battle was a rhythmic, bone-deep struggle, where the boy's partner had to use its speed to evade strikes that could shatter the very foundation of the hall. This was a test of the body's resilience, a reminder that the spirit needs a sturdy vessel to carry its light. The boy triumphed by finding the grace within the power, proving that a flexible heart could outlast even the hardest stone. Deepening his ascent, the air grew heavy with a familiar, lavender-scented mist. He entered the third hall, the domain of Agatha, the eldest of the masters and the keeper of the region's spectral memories. Her arena was a place of flickering shadows and whispering echoes, a mirror of the Pokémon Tower he had climbed in the east. She challenged the boy with the ghosts of the past, testing his ability to maintain his focus when the world around him became an illusion. This was a trial of the mind's clarity. The boy relied on the wisdom he had gained from the mother's spirit in lavender, refusing to be shaken by the specters of doubt. He moved through the gloom with a steady light, showing that the memory of the past was not a chain, but a guide for the present. Finally, the boy reached the highest chamber, where the air roared with the heat of 1,000 fires and the pressure of a descending storm. This was the Hall of Lance, the master of the dragons, the primordial beings that had ruled the skies since the first dawn. To face the dragons was to face the raw, unbridled energy of the world itself. The arena was a vast, open space where the wind whipped with the force of a hurricane. The battle was a cinematic clash of mythic proportions. The boy's spark faced the ancient flames and the crushing weight of the dragon's wings. It was here that the boy's journey reached its elemental peak. He did not defeat the dragons with force, but with a resonance that matched their own ancient heartbeat. Lance stood aside, his cape flowing like a dragon's wing, acknowledging that the boy had finally unified the fractured elements of Kanto. However, the final throne was not empty. Waiting in the ultimate chamber was the rival, the wanderer who had reached the plateau just moments before him. This was the final intersection of their parallel paths. The rival represented the pinnacle of individual ambition, a mastery born of a desire to be the absolute best, unburdened by the complications of the heart. The stadium was silent, the eyes of the region's history watching as the two children of Pallet Town faced each other for the last time. The battle was a masterpiece of total synchronization. Every move was a dialogue, every strike a question about the purpose of power. The boy fought with the weight of every friend he had made, every spirit he had calmed, and every forest he had saved. When the final spark faded, the boy stood as the new champion of Kanto. The silence that followed was not one of defeat, but of profound completion. The rival, in the grace of his loss, realized that the boy's strength had always come from the depth of his connections rather than the height of his pride. Professor Oak, the chronicler who had started them on this path, entered the hall to record their victory in the Hall of Fame, the eternal ledger of the region's heart. The boy's journey was no longer a personal quest. It had become the new foundation for the land's recovery. The industrial shadows and the psychic storms were finally balanced by a light that was both human and mythic. As the boy stood on the highest balcony of the plateau, looking out over the moonlit valleys of his home, he felt a familiar psychic presence. Far to the north, in the Cerulean Cave, the entity known as Mewtwo felt the boy's coronation. The barrier of isolation that had defined the creature's life finally dissolved. It recognized that the world was no longer a place of glass and calculation, but a place where even a manufactured life could find a purpose. The legendary birds took flight one last time, their wings painting the night sky with the colors of the rainbow mark. The story of the Great Awakening had reached its conclusion, and the era of the true bond had finally, irrevocably begun. The dawn was breaking over Pallet Town as the boy began his journey back home, his partner resting on his shoulder, both of them carried by the quiet, enduring rhythm of the living world.